further ado, I'm going to just hand it off to our moderator, Nicholas Short. He is the civilian manager for SAS Federal, and he's going to take the lead for the session. So thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Greg, Bob, Keith. I thought, when I was reading about this panel discussion, it was kind of interesting looking at the title of the ever-changing or ever-evolving role of IT leadership managing in a service-heavy IT ecosystem. I couldn't get out of my mind one thought, and that is just how challenging it must be these days to work for the government. I know back in my day, we actually had money, and you could spend it without having to memorize the FARs, 6 Ways to Sunday. Back in my day, continuing resolutions were more of an anomaly than they are the norm today. You didn't have things like debt ceiling or fiscal cliff or even the S word, sequestration. And you also didn't have a lot of the press constantly hammering the government for being too big and too bloated and too inefficient. And I got to thinking about the latest agency in the press, and that's the IRS. I kind of thinking, a lot of people think it's too big, right? I mean, how many of you in this room think the IRS is too small? Oh, come on. Well, it's funny, sitting here on the private industry side, you're told that all the time, and yet let's kind of look at the facts. Consider another company, perhaps the size of the IRS, Bank of America. Bank of America manages about $2.4 trillion in assets. The IRS collects about $2.4 trillion in revenue. Bank of America, how many of you think Bank of America has about 100,000 employees? Anybody? 200? More. About 280,000 employees. What about the IRS? How many of you think 300,000? It's about 90,000. Revenue for Bank of America, about $83 billion in revenue. The IRS budget, $12 billion. So clearly, private industry and Bank of America needs to learn from the IRS in terms of being a paragon of efficiency. It's kind of in the context of that I think of IT and some of the things we've been doing for years, which is how do you make things more efficient? How do you create decision support systems that give you the right thing at the right time so that you can make the best decisions so you don't end up in the press? That's kind of our business. And I think with that context, I'd like to hear from all three of you about some of the innovative, collaborative techniques around dealing with cost sharing, being able to be more efficient, just like the IRS is. So Greg, I'm going to pick on you first. Thinking about risk proofing and risk management and things like that. I know the GAO does a lot of audits, and in fact, if you think about financial intelligence and financial risk, that's really what you do at the end of the day. I'm working with a lot of different agencies. So, one of the state learning objectives today is on the panel is to discuss becoming risk-proof, really in an unpredictable, and surely is unpredictable, environment, both from a strategic and kind of operational risk side. So what are some of the steps that you're seeing in agencies or, say, other organizations within the government that are taking to make themselves more risk-proof?
Thank you very much, Nick, for the question. And first of all, since you did mention the IRS and everything, we audit the IRS on an annual basis. GAO audits their financial statements. And for the last several years, we've been issuing unqualified opinions on their ability to present their information. And this past year is the first year that we were able to report only a significant deficiency in their information security control. So this is actually an improvement and kind of an testament to what IRS is trying to accomplish over at its agency. For many years, we have been reporting a material weakness in information security controls. And that is because they do. They have a lot of, well, I won't say antiquated, but they have a lot of legacy systems that they're trying to modernize. But they are making a lot of progress in that effort. Still more needs to be done, obviously, but certainly IRS is making progress in a number of different areas. And also, it's now has our Chief Administrative Officer. David Fisher has been over at GAO for 2 years and just recently left to go over to become the Chief Risk Officer over at IRS too. And I think that's in direct response to some of the headlines that have been in the news recently about IRS. But to get to your question, I don't think any agency or any organization can actually become risk-proof, particularly in what I think was billed as an unpredictable environment. Unpredictability inherently, by its very nature, introduces risk. And so it's unlikely, and it's probably inappropriate, I would even say, for agencies to try to become risk-proof, mainly because it's likely not to be cost-effective, either in terms of the costs and trying to implement the safeguards and controls in order to eliminate all risk, or in perhaps lost productivity or functionality capability that you may otherwise have in the interest of trying to eliminate risk. And so I don't think that's really the goal, is risk-proofing an agency. It's more managing the risk that an agency has. And as just to give a little background, at least of my experience, at GAO, I work on the information security issues and cybersecurity issues. And so I've pretty much focused on those topics, and we review audits and conduct audits. We review the information security practices and policies at federal agencies across the executive branch, as well as looking at the federal entities and how they interact primarily with DHS, with the critical infrastructure owners in protecting the cybersecurity over critical infrastructure. And so my remarks are going to be tilted towards the security side. I think my other panelists over here, Bob and Keith, will probably talking more from perhaps other aspects related to IT management as well. But related to information security, some of the key aspects that agencies need to do, and indeed their partners in securing their systems, are to first thing is to conduct a risk assessment and identify the information and systems, what the functions are, and how critical that information and those systems are to the mission of the organization, and what would be the impact should the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of that information be compromised. And based on that, determine what set of controls are necessary in order to help provide a level of protection over those systems. And so some of the actions that agencies need to do is do this risk assessment, select the controls that are appropriate and cost effective, because again, the goal here is not to avoid or eliminate all risk, but rather to cost effectively manage it to an acceptable level. And then based on those security controls that they implement over their IT resources, to be able to then implement them, train their staffs and appropriately to assure that they're being followed, and establish appropriate review and accountability mechanisms to assess that on a continuing and ongoing basis as the environment changes. Because as you mentioned, we are in an unpredictable environment, and certainly the federal agencies are in a very dynamic environment in which the threats to systems, in which the computing environments themselves and business practices, new technologies emerge, and all of those introduce risks which need to be appropriately managed. And so that will be probably one of the key aspects that they can do to help minimize those risks.
So just kind of a follow-on question. I mean, you mentioned several interesting things, but one thing came to mind. I work for SAS, and we're known as the statistics company, and we deal with a lot of folks on Wall Street in terms of risk management, and we think of everything in terms of a number and how you might score risk or how you might quantify risk. What are some of the things that around risk scoring or risk analysis from a quantifiable point of view have you all thought about?
Oh yeah, we certainly have, and indeed we conducted an audit over at the Department of State, I guess it was a couple years ago now, over its risk scoring system. It had developed a system was based on continuous monitoring principles as one of the first agencies to kind of develop this system. It was called iPost. And a key component of that system was scoring the vulnerabilities that it would identify in order to help determine risk. And what it used, it would go through and basically have various different tools that would go out, scan various different devices and systems, identify various configuration items that were not in accordance with their policies, as well as vulnerabilities. Then using those, after they have identified those particular vulnerabilities, they would then use this mechanism called the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, which is available on NIST website. It's part of the National Vulnerability Database, or it's a section of it, and use the scores that have been identified for similar weaknesses or vulnerabilities in its scoring mechanism and practice on that system. It would then take that score that was included in the Common Vulnerability Scoring System and then actually run a mathematical formula over it, which was basically cubing the number and then dividing by 100. And the purpose of that was to give greater separation between the higher risk vulnerabilities and actions versus the lower one. There's this greater separation. And the purpose for doing that was to make sure that their employees and the administrators and the information security officers would focus on the highest risk vulnerabilities and configuration items first. And by doing that, that would lower their score. And then they would take that score from the devices and the individual systems and roll them up, and then basically give each office or each administrator a score, which would then be published, and it would create kind of a competitive atmosphere where individuals did not want to have the highest score. So the theory was that it would help to reduce the risk and improve security by focusing on those higher risk actions.
Thanks, Greg. Bob, Greg talked a lot about cyber and risk scoring and things like that. I know you all have a similar problem in DOE, in dealing with risk, because you got critical infrastructure you've got to deal with. How would you all define it? Is it just in cyber or is it in other areas? And for that matter, you've got a lot of data too as well to deal with. So risk management against a lot of data and a lot of information, that's a pretty tough problem. So how would you all define it and deal with it?
Well, I think, when folks ask me about, the cyber and the risk management challenges in the Department of Energy, I always like to start with, on one hand, we're doing open collaborative scientific exchanges with the Chinese Academy of Scientists. And on the other end, we're responsible for the design and the security and the safety of the nuclear weapons stockpile. And the challenge is that some of the labs that do the Chinese open scientific exchange are also responsible for nuclear weapons information. So, so that's kind of the breadth of our challenge. And I think that, well, first of all, we moved forward with risk management kind of out of the compliance world in May of 2011. And so we've been on this journey for a couple of years, and it's not a small challenge, but I think you've got to kind of balance between your compliance requirements, our FISMA requirements and those things that are levied upon us by law and by Homeland Security, with the need to protect as well as be open with our financial systems and with our data. So, the open scientific data, and then obviously on the flip side, sensitive information, but also classified. And then, counterbalancing that is all of the technical challenges in risk management, just the whole business of the continuous monitoring, what's on your network, the strong authentication and who's on your network, and then obviously knowing what's happening on your network by monitoring and through trusted internet connection, those things. And then on the opposite side of the technical controls and tightening down on and reducing risk is the need to be able to operate on at the end of the day. And so business operations become pretty critical. So, we try to balance between those four things all the time, and what we've done is we've actually, I'm not responsible per se for directly managing the risk in the thousands and thousands of systems across our 100+ sites. But what we've done is we've aligned that risk management accountability into our line management. And so, you know, we have 3 undersecretaries, and they're responsible for making sure that this risk management framework and the risk management process are driven down in a way that meets their mission requirements. And then I do that for the federal systems and for the headquarters. And then we meet periodically to go over those things and to share lessons learned. But risk is something that's really got to be managed. You know, it's the beginning of risk management is down at the local level. I mean, because in the end, business has got to get done. And then that's got to roll up and fit into your overarching risk management framework from a corporate perspective and the risk that your secretary or your chief executive is willing to accept. And I think you know what we're trying to do is bucket those things into categories of, hey, you know, on the open science side, you're really more worried about things like the integrity of the scientific research and that people aren't altering results or trying to contaminate the scientific evidence that's there. You're also looking to try to ensure that you've got a lot of availability, and we have, you know, big pipes that go back and forth across the world as we move petabyte-sized files from the CERN, you know, over into our laboratory environment for big data analytics. And then, you know, when it comes to more of our sensitive, our controlled unclassified information, then it becomes more of a confidentiality issue, and we're willing to take hits on availability as long as we can ensure that nobody can get to that. So I think that's kind of where it is. It's, you know, it's compliance and data, openness and protection, and it's business operations versus, you know, really twisting down on the vulnerabilities.
So I guess you have to make a lot of trade-offs in terms of decision-making to balance risk versus reward. You mentioned big data analytics. Is there any application of that to risk? And what else are you doing in that area?
Well, I mean, clearly there's a lot of opportunity there. I think that to make this practical risk management can't be turned into a science project. And, you know, when you're an organization with 100,000 scientists, it's really easy to turn this into the world's largest probabilistic risk assessment. But big data analytics are important from a perspective of knowing what's happening on your network and looking at new and innovative ways to assess and manage that risk. And so, you know, you can say, hey, you know, we've seen all these things hitting against our firewalls, or, you know, we know exactly how many vulnerabilities are in our systems. But if you start to look at your IT ecosystem as an organism or as a system of systems, you start to get a handle on what the normal behavior of that system is. And those are places where I think that in the future we'll be able to know before we get attacked and before we get something that says, hey, by the way, there's this big exfil happening right now and you might want to do something about it, is you'll be able to see anomalies because you'll be constantly baselining your system activity, and you'll notice things that would not have risen to your attention previously by setting just thresholds on things. So I think that's where big data is going to be very valuable. And as more and more things get on the network, it's going to become somewhat of a big data problem.
Well, yeah, you have a lot of the system logs that are generating alerts nonstop, and you're dealing with, you know, a lot of data that's constantly being generated. Interesting. Keith, I guess we met when you were at BTA. I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on this from a DoD perspective, first and foremost. But second, you know, at the VA, you are dealing with a lot of really precious assets that are returning veterans. And I know that there's been a huge surge in claims and things like that. It's risky not to serve those folks. So I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on what do you think about risk management as it applies to both DoD and VA specifically?
It's amazing. The interesting times that we are in right now is making sure that you're chasing the right technology and yet bringing capability to your customer at the same time, and then protecting that data. We have over 4 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that we service every single day. We provide them with their benefits, whether that be education or whether that be their loan guarantees, their hospitalization as far as health is concerned, and then also cemeteries. So those are the three big ones as far as the VA. In every one of those, that is where most people are most susceptible to being attacked. Hospitals, benefits, college, and cemeteries. And so one of the things that we are doing right now is that we have implemented a capability that we call PMAS. And PMAS is just how we manage things, how we make sure that we're delivering capability to the customer as well as to the veteran rapidly. If you look at today, I'll go back to my DoD days. In the DoD, it takes you 91 months to get to IOC. I don't know about you, but that's 8 years. And that means technology has changed 4 different times at least if you go by Moore's Law, maybe 5 times in 91 months. Also, their acquisition process is cumbersome, to say the least. And I was an acquisition executive in the DoD. And then I come over to the VA, and they made a decision that we're not going to do that. How do we manage our risk? How do we manage our systems? And how do we deliver capabilities? Go back over to the GAO. GAO, just a couple of years ago, said that the federal government is spending close to over $90 billion in IT. I don't know about the rest of you, but that's a lot of money. Actually, I think that's the DoD that spends $90 billion on IT. And who knows what the rest of it is as far as the federal government. 64% of what we develop in the federal government is never used or hardly used. 64%. So if you take the math, which I know you're not supposed to do math in public, $90 billion, 64%, that's a buttload of money that we're blowing. So you've got to put the processes in place in order to protect. Go back to your IRS thing, is that we're putting a lot of money into the IRS. You and I, we have to be more efficient. As a taxpayer and as a servant of the people, I'm responsible for delivering capability the best I can and not just spending money. 64% is a lot of money. So what we did is we actually started to attack this thing called PMAS. It's a disciplined thing. We deliver customer-facing capabilities every 6 months. Every 6 months. So we have a program that goes to projects, from projects into increments. Every increment is less than 6 months. And inside of that, and by the way, we deliver anywhere between 80 to 90% on-time delivery. The average for the commercial industry is roughly 40 to 50% on-time delivery. The rest of the federal government is right about the same time. So we're delivering customer-facing capabilities, cutting down the risk. And one of the things that we do as far as cutting down that risk is that we put the responsibility on the back of the program manager in order to deliver that capability. And we give them the assets that they need to ensure that they get it done. And if anything is a roadblock to them while they're doing it, they elevate it quickly. They have yellow flags, we have yellow flags. That's a warning. Red flags, it's business. And you bring it and you expose where the problem is. Contracting is giving you a problem. Contracting is now on the hot seat. I love it when contracting is on the hot seat. If it's the financial side, Congress is doing this, whatever the case might be, we've had to reprogram, whatever it is, that is brought to the table and senior people make decisions. If it's just the fact that you're getting your security clearance through, that's a fun one, okay? So it's exposed and it's brought to the level that's necessary, because if you're doing this speed of heat as far as delivering capability every 6 months, you've got to have that kind of risk management in place to do it. And that's what PMAS brings to the table. It brings to the table discipline. It brings to the table the ability to get something done and also to track it. Okay, so now guess what? We now can go back and we can look at where are the problems happening. So now we can say, well, hold on a minute. Most of our problems when we're implementing or developing something is, let's say, the contracting office. So now we can take that and we can focus some of our attention for the long term, not the lagging indicators, but the indicators that give us the thing that we can go back in and no kidding, focus in on where the problem is within the organization. That's what PMAS brings to the table. It allows us to do it, deliver customer-facing capabilities within 6 months, and giving capability to our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines to get their benefits.
So it's interesting. A couple thoughts in listening to you. One is I'm thinking about the previous administration's President's Management Agenda about going to green and things like that. And I guess part of the premise there was if you provide transparency, which obviously is something this administration wants to do, but if you apply transparency and you make it very broad, the system also or sort of becomes self-corrective. I mean, are you seeing that with PMAS and things like that, that people are just starting to get in alignment real quick, like contracting, maybe?
When the spotlight is focused in on you, you tend to get the roadblocks out of the way.
Yeah.
I mean, because when a red flag is thrown, the customer's in the room, the individual who's causing the problem is in the room, and the program manager is in the room along with senior people. You know, things get done.
Let's not forget about congressional oversight.
Yeah.
I know that was a challenge with the ERP systems, for example, for a few years,
Yeah.
closing the books.
I'll be quite honest with you. I think one of the key things that is necessary today, too, is strong change management within organizations. I fundamentally believe this, and let me define change management. But there's some of you in the room that believe that change management is when you change things within the scope of the project. Okay, I'm going to change this capability, this requirement, this requirement, this requirement. That's not the change management I'm talking about. I'm talking about change management within the organization to adapt to the new technology that's coming on board. We are not doing this very well in the federal government. We're not doing that when we buy ERPs, and we're not doing that very well when we're buying commercial off-the-shelf technologies. Why? How do I know that? The big thing is because we are spending a serious amount of money on customization. We customize the dickens out of everything. And it's because we're not taking an innovative approach to this. We're not rewarding government employees to say, stop it. I'm going to reward you, or I'm going to fire you if you don't change your business processes. We talk this business process reengineering stuff up the kazoo, and yet we don't really hold anybody accountable to it. I challenge each one of you to take a look at the front page of the Information Technology magazine and all the people that were sitting on the front cover of that, and go back and see if any of those folks ever delivered. And that it didn't cost a significant amount of money of what they were trying to do. We blame the technology, we blame the ERPs, and we blame the commercial off-the-shelf technologies. In reality, it's us that's costing that. It is us. And it's because we're not holding people accountable and we're not rewarding good behavior. We're rewarding bad behavior. Look at the financial ERPs. The financial ERPs, we blame them. In fact, the GAO actually wrote a report, about our implementation of ERPs. But did we ever hold anybody accountable to that? Billions of dollars. DLA spent $2 billion of customizing an SAP ERP. $2 billion, and nobody cared. Nobody got fired. So the thing is that we've got to change our behavior as far as change management. Because if the organization does not change to adapt to the technology, we have failure. And there is a risk. It's a significant risk. It's a financial risk. It's a risk to the soldiers, sailors, and Marines if we do not implement solid change management practices when implementing technology.
Well,
I'll get off my high horse.
I couldn't agree more. Actually, in full disclosure, I used to work for SAP. And we were having those discussions internally at the time about, well, the whole purpose of ERP is to adapt to those processes because they've been designed, believe me, meticulously, to be efficient. And yet the first thing that happens is you go in there and say, well, let's automate a really inefficient process and make it go faster.
Yeah.
So,
And the other thing too is that we haven't really taken a good Six Sigma approach to things. I mean, it's like at the very beginning, we ought to be saying, here's my process. 90% of it is manual. A lot of you have heard the comedian on TV about some of the VA paperwork. And if you haven't, go look at YouTube. But there's actually a building in Washington, D.C. that the paperwork is has become so heavy that it's actually sagging the floors. And the thing is that we, at the very beginning, what we ought to be doing is that looking at our process, and if we are at 90% manual, and we're going to spend $500 million, or excuse me, $500 million on developing an IT system, then after it's developed or delivered, we ought to know that we have now moved that bar from 90% manual to 80% digital. And we're okay with the other 20% being manual. But the thing is that we don't do that very well. We don't do that well at all.
Greg, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just like to echo what Keith just mentioned about accountability, and I think accountability is key. Of course, I work at an organization whose middle name is accountability.
Yeah.
But I think it really is important, and a lot of times people are not held accountable for actions which they probably should be held accountable. You know, just within the information security sphere, many of the senior executives and program managers at federal agencies don't have a performance metric or standard for which they're measured against related to assuring that the security over their information systems is adequate and appropriate for the mission's need. And I think presently there's probably a bill, I think there's a bill before Congress now that would change that would make information security a performance metric for individuals. And then the other side of that too is when there are accountability measures and responsibilities set, for example, with those in each agency, there's a designated accrediting authority, I think they're called. And they're the ones that are signing on the dotted line, so to speak, to accept the risk for the operation of an information system or security over that system. Well, how many times have those systems been broken into, information may have been exfiltrated or changed, or breaches occurred with that systems? To what extent have those DAAs been held accountable for that? I'm not aware of any where they have actually suffered any adverse effect, except for maybe one or two instances. I take that back. One being over at VA a few years ago, back when there was a data breach, and it really wasn't over a particular system. And then also recently when there was a breach over the thrift savings plan information, and the head of that organization was called before a hearing and had to testify at a hearing in Congress. But often the signatories over those systems aren't necessarily held to account, which may lead to a propensity to sign off and accept risks that may not be warranted.
But isn't there also a tendency to, I mean, with all the outsourcing and so forth, I'm thinking of the topic of third-party data, for example. I know you were talking about China and so forth. Isn't there also a tendency to kind of point fingers and, you know, especially in a managed service IT environment, where it could be very easy to point at the cloud and go, well, there's nobody in the cloud. You know, you can't point at the accountability because it's a cloud, right? I mean, so how do you deal with that, Greg?
I think that's a very good question, particularly with the cloud. And as you know, under the Cloud First policy, agencies are moving more and more to the cloud environment. And that was one of the areas where often the policy, sometimes it does, or I should say the technology outpaces the policy. But holding accountability in the cloud, I think, is one of the great challenges for agencies. We did a review I guess it's about 3 years now, just looking at the security implications of federal agencies migrating to the cloud and putting their applications, their data in cloud environments. And while we found there were several very positive security benefits that could come from that, we also identified, and this was basically based on a survey that we gave to the 24 CFO Act agencies and their responses. 22 out of the 24 said that they were very concerned about the security over their data. And to a large extent, that related, one, because they didn't have control over that data. They didn't necessarily know where it might be located, who could have access to it. Another key security concern that they identified was having the ability, one, to assure that the service provider was meeting their federal requirements and implementing the appropriate security controls, but also then having the ability to independently assess that capability and the security controls that the cloud service provider would implement over the data. And so that was one of the key issues, was being able to know just how well security is being implemented, which is, of course, a key thing for accountability. Now, since then, GSA, DHS, DoD, and others have come up with FedRAMP, which is a program which is intended to help identify the specific security controls that should be in place by cloud service providers in their cloud service environment, having an independent third party come in and assess the implementation, the design and implementation of those controls, and then having a joint authorization board to give provisional authority for that particular cloud environment to operate. And so by establishing performance measures, establishing clear security requirements that the entities need to implement, that's one, and having the performance measures, independent assessment, and then having some sort of incentives for positive behavior, penalties for substandard behavior is one way to help establish some sort of accountability.
Yeah, that's got to be tough culturally. I mean, at the agency I worked for, we were hacked into very early on in my career. It was actually one of our machines, and actually my office mate used to name his process as Secret Agent Man. And you can imagine how well that went over with the IG's office when they came in. It was a science agency that I worked for. And Bob, I got to imagine that you have a lot of scientists, and you have cultural openness, which is the nature of science. I mean, that's got to be an issue in dealing with IT in the cloud and so forth. I mean, how do you get around that?
Well, I don't know that you get around it. A lot of it, some of it's education, and when you, in some of this, we kind of look at the argument, three ways, and the logical arguments would seem to work well with a bunch of engineers and scientists, but generally it doesn't work very well, and so you gotta make it a life or death thing for them. I mean, and I don't mean a physical life or death thing, but a programmatic and scientific research life or death thing, because that they view cyber and other controls and. Hey, if you're going to move this stuff to the cloud, or you want to host this in your infrastructure rather than the server that I built under my desk, is that you've got to convince them that the risk to their program, the risk to their livelihood, to their scientific reputation is greater if they do it on their own and that than if they follow your path. The other is to really get after their belief system, the ethos of the problem, and find out what it is that makes them believe in the way that they do things and the way that they perceive and manage risk, and then try to work on that aspect of it. But, Greg's comment about, cloud and FedRAMP and all that, and I'll tell you that, I joke a lot about wanting to be the first federal CIO that's out of the IT business, and that, we get to that service-oriented world where we can buy and shift services as easily as I can at home. But I'm also pretty confident that if I move stuff into one of these big cloud providers, whether they're FedRAMP certified or not, is that if it gets hacked and a whole bunch of sensitive data gets exfiltrated, that when Chairman Issa calls me, that my response of, well, call my cloud provider isn't going to go over very well. So there has to be a true partnership handshake here and some transparency, pane of glass ability for your own technical folks to be able to look in and watch the operations of what's going on, and then know how you're going to pre-negotiate with that cloud provider of when you can reach in and how you partner to take control of a bad situation. So, Christy's going to wave at you. 15? We have 15 minutes?
15 minutes.
Wow, we have an eternity.
Wow, that went by quickly. Actually, looks like we have 10.
So I think that's going to be really important, and, you know, I've asked Anil and some of my folks to actually, you know, kind of set up an integrated project team about how are we going to manage the risk of all these multiple cloud services that are coming into our environment. It's pretty easy to manage one. I mean, maybe not easy, but it's at least a manageable challenge. But if I start to spread these things out, is how do I manage the additive and the multiplicative risk that comes with that? And so that's why we're working so hard, and those of you that spent time with Anil yesterday on our cloud brokerage system, to try to automate some of that risk management process.
So we talked a lot about risk, one of my favorite subjects, but let's talk about cost, which I'm sure is one of yours. What benefits are you seeing in the cloud in terms of cost savings? I mean, is it really happening? I mean, you really seeing a benefit in terms of cost versus the risk? I'll go with you, Bob, first.
Well, I don't know how many savings we've actually realized yet, but you know, looking at what we think the unit cost or the transaction cost and those types of things are, we believe pretty strongly that there are efficiencies to be gained there. Because the scale and that the commercial firms have and that the cloud providers have, we just can't match it.
Right.
So we're pretty confident. But I think that from our perspective, we probably don't have the insight on cost at the level that we need to make good comparative analysis. We know how much we spend on things. We have that down pat. You know, we know how to budget and we know how to spend. But when it comes down to actually assigning costs and going back to, you know, some of the things we did back in the 90s with activity-based costing and things like that, is those concepts, whether you want to get into that level of detail or not, haven't been applied broad enough to really understand how to do comparative cost analysis. So some of this becomes a little bit of a belief system.
But isn't that because the cost of doing activity-based costing is often higher than the benefits that you get from it? I mean, I've always looked at that and thought, gee, you know, being a statistics company, why don't you sample that and use statistics to get good enough?
Yeah, and so you can do that. The other is that, you know, as we develop these service plans and we get ready to compete something and move it to the cloud, is forcing, you know, some of this comes into the accountability piece of whether it's a project or not, but the project has to be resource loaded in a way that you can identify what resources am I going to offload out of my organization, and unfortunately that includes people.
Yeah.
You know, these people, you know, my HR director said she'd shoot me if I said it to my staff, but I said, hey, my goal is in 3 years, half of you will be here doing something else than what you're doing today. The other half of you will be somewhere else doing something else. Because as we move this stuff out, it's never going to be cheaper if you keep the same amount of labor and you're still, you know, trying to hoard little pieces of the infrastructure. All you do is redistribute the same cost, and you don't really get any better.
Interesting. Greg, you probably see a lot of this, you know, in audits and so forth. I mean, how is it working?
Well, I think that's, I think what Bob just mentioned at the very end there is spot on. We did a review 2 years ago in which we looked at cloud implementations and we looked at 7 agencies. But this was under the cloud initiative, in which agencies were required to move 3 applications or systems off to the cloud environment by the end of July 2012, I think it was. And what we found, we looked at the plans that 7 agencies had for moving those 3 applications out, and only 7 out of the 20 did not have any information about the costs associated with that migration and with that move. In addition, none of the plans, none of the 20 that we looked at, actually addressed how they were going to dispose of or repurpose the infrastructure or the systems that they were migrating off to the cloud environment. And so that's really is a key part of it. It's one, not only just moving off, you know, the applications and your services off, but then what do you do with what remains? And that speaks directly to Bob's point about not only is it just the technology and the services, but it's also the people. And how do you manage that? And so that is something that's certainly is a key consideration in any migration to the cloud.
Interesting. Well, an old boss of mine said once that you can't manage what you can't measure, and I'm thinking, Keith, PMAS sounds like an interesting approach for setting the right parameters, so to speak. Tell me about that in the context of cost savings.
Excuse me. Well, I've already kind of alluded to PMAS as far as our accountability. The thing about PMAS is that everything is tracked. For instance, you get a milestone 0. Milestone 0 is that you've now gone into your planning stage. You're sitting there with the customer, you're walking through all their requirements, you're making sure that you understand, and you put out the contract, you put out the RFP. That's in milestone 0. When you come for your milestone 0, there is a senior leader as the chair of that milestone 0. All right? The customer is there, the PM is there, contracting is there, they're there. You come into your milestone 0. You've got 90 days to get through your milestone 0. You get your RFP, you get your contract let, you now come to the board, you get your milestone 1. Milestone 1 says you are good to go. You've got all your life cycle costs, you've got your testing set up, you've got everything, and everything is laid out. So all your dependencies are there. Testing is laid out, your dependencies of other systems, your customer has created all of their scenarios as far as for testing is concerned. Your testing blocks are all set up, so you're tracking that all the way through. You got your milestone 1. You have now 6 months in which to complete milestone 1, all right? And through that time, you're going through reviews. So now you're developing, right? When you get into your development, you're going through your testing, you're now going into deployment. Milestone 2, I'm going to deploy. You're telling the organization, you're telling the customer, we're ready to deploy. You have gone through user acceptance testing, you are now going into prod, and you're saying to the organization, are you ready? Everything is transparent in that process, okay? So now the customer knows it's gonna happen. Testing folks, the prod folks, the infrastructure folks, all know it's gonna happen. And if something happens that weekend when you go live, guess what? The spotlight is on you. If the infrastructure folks did not tell the new development guys that they were making a change to Windows 7 or whatever you're doing, and now all of a sudden that screws up everything, guess where that spotlight goes? That spotlight goes right to that infrastructure, folks. Why is it? We've gone through this. You're part of the IPT. We put a lot of stress on the IPTs, integrated product teams, for those who didn't know it, okay? So if any time during that process something happens, you can throw those red flags. You can elevate those things. Now, let's say you've now gone through your deployment. You now have a few months in which you make sure that it's all okay, and then you actually go into sustainment. So it quickly moves into sustainment. And so these folks their focus is on development. These folks, it's on sustainment. Where if you go to like the DoD and most of the federal government, you got a PM that's responsible for the whole end-to-end, and so you have all these competing processes, and it doesn't work if you're trying to get speed of heat and use the agile approach to development and then delivery. Let the sustainment folks do that. We were moving in that direction, the same thing over at BTA when I was over there.
Well, I kind of started the conversation up with that. I think it's much harder to work for the government than back in my day. We've got a few more minutes left. So Keith, I think you just proved that. That's a very challenging thing you're doing. I kind of want to end the conversation up with maybe a broader topic and what's happening to the CIO position. You know, when I got in government, it was an offshoot of the finance office, and it really has adapted over the last 10 to 15 years. So Bob, I'm going to start off with you. How's it changing? And you kind of intimated that you want to go out of business, it sounded like.
Well, I want to get out of the owning and operating infrastructure business, but I think that, over the years, whether we've read about it or we've experienced it, where we're trying to get to is where the line of business owners, your bureaus, your program offices, your undersecretaries, are making decisions about how they're going to meet their mission requirements, and part of that conversation should include the Chief Information Officer. It should include the Chief Information Security Officer. It should include your Chief Financial Officer, your Chief Acquisitions Officer, or Senior Procurement Executive. But that it's a team sport as you're moving forward and applying technology to meeting the mission requirements. I think that's where we really want to be. We want to be that trusted partner, that broker advisor that helps you find the technical solution that meets your mission needs, and then broker that for you so that we can take that burden away from you and you can stay focused on meeting your mission, whether it's border protection, whether it's immigration, whether it's taxes, revenue collection, or whatever. So that's the real goal there.
Great. Well, thanks. I think, are there any questions from the audience? I think, yeah. Since we're running out of time.
Yeah, my name is Gail Becker from HHS. I have a question for Mr. Seaman. You mentioned that 64% of what the government develops is rarely or never used. Where is that statistic published, and how is that data collected?
Okay, so it's in the GAO report. I think it's 2010 or 11. But the GAO did a complete study on the utilization of IT. And that's not, that, you might think that's a outlandish number. The thing is that if you really dig and if you have an enterprise architecture that allows you to see how much, when you can see that and you can see how rarely something is used and see that you're spending $5 million on that a year to do that, let me tell you, you need to make some decisions. And what's happening is we're not making decisions when we see that kind of data. And we should be. We are responsible to the taxpayer.
And I'll pile on that. We did a recent analysis of a lot of the commodity services we provide out of our office, and one of the glaring statistics was that in our desktop services is that we've bundled this stuff up over time, is that the average utilization of the services in that bundle is 34%. 60% of the services that we deliver as part of your monthly fee don't get used by the average consumer. And so we're debundling that stuff and restructuring it and pulling and stopping those things that aren't being used.
All right, with that, we're going to have to close out the session. Panelists, thank you very much.